So I wanted to record some thinking about the question that we did for a test your understanding for week 1. Using the information in the table and your knowledge of economics, evaluate the use of GDP per capita and GNI per capita as the basis for measuring economic development and as the basis for making comparisons of standards of living across countries. So the first thing that I thought of when I thought to answer this question is I thought of some of the limitations of GNI and GDP per capita. In other words, I looked at some of the limitations. What are some of the things that income doesn't measure? So if I was going to respond to this, the first 3 things that came into my head were it doesn't take into account the environmental consequences of the income or of the production. It doesn't take into account health or education. And it also doesn't take into account the equity or the distribution of that income. So I might talk about green GDP per capita being a more interesting measure. I might mention the Human Development Index as being something that takes into account health and education. Or I might mention the Gini coefficient as a way to talk about equity. Now, all of those responses are just general responses and have nothing to do with the table. And it's really important if you want to get into the highest mark band to talk about things that are in the table. So the most obvious things to me when looking at the table here are looking at Japan and the UK and looking at Georgia and Brazil. Those countries actually have, it seems like, for example, with the UK and Japan, the UK has a higher GDP and GNI per capita than Japan does, but Japan has a higher Human Development Index. And so what that tells us is that Japan has better health outcomes and better educational outcomes than Britain does. And I might argue that health and education are kind of the point of income. Those are 2 great measures of how well you're using your income. So even though the UK is able to produce more per person than Japan, Japan is able to use that production more efficiently for 2 of the major outcomes that I think we care about, which is our education and our health. And those are some of the things that have the highest positive externalities of consumption. And so there's a real incentive for societies and for governments to promote the health and education of their citizens. On the other hand, if we look at Brazil and Georgia, we'll see that they are essentially the same on the Human Development Index, 73rd and 74th overall, separated by less than 1% in terms of their HDI score. And yet Georgia is able to accomplish this with less than 1/3 the total GDP per capita. Georgia uses its resources much more efficiently than Brazil. And so all of these things lead me to have some great concerns about GDP or GNI per capita in terms of a measure of development in general. So I've made this argument and that's what I believe, but to really have a good shot at the highest mark band, I need to come back now and I need to come up with something to kind of praise about GNI and GDP. So I think what I would point out is that GNI and GDP are actually pretty good rough overall measurements. So for example, if we're just separating countries into tiers, it's obvious that the UK and Japan, because of their really high GDP per capita, are in just a different tier from Brazil or Georgia. So GDP and GNI per capita can be a good rough measure of the development of countries, but in terms of actually comparing individual countries, it's probably not that strong of a measure all by itself, at least for these 4 countries that we have. And so I think those would be some of the major points that you'd want to make if you were doing this. Another route, which I haven't talked about, but is to talk about purchasing power parity, which is column 4 in the graph, in the graph. And purchasing power parity makes it obvious, or more obvious, that the UK and Japan actually have very similar purchasing power parities. So that would make sense that the UK wasn't so far ahead in terms of human development. So that purchasing power parity solves some of the problems. So maybe my final conclusion would be that GNI and GDP per capita aren't the best measures of development, but that if you are going to use them, you should definitely use the purchasing power parity models. So that's just the sort of way that I would think about approaching that question. I would have my generic answer ready to go. I would state that. Then I'd come back and find specific examples from the text or from the graph, and then I'd come up with, well, but on the other hand, and then I'd try to reach some sort of a new conclusion. So that would be our recommendation for how you deal with those sorts of questions, and specifically that question dealing with development.